Welcome to the USDA Rural Energy for America program. That's what REAP stands for, an MDAR Ag Energy Grant webinar. I've done this a couple of times, so if I start to go too fast, please just let me know. Throughout the presentation, you're going to see some pictures that I have added of farms and projects that have successfully received either an MDAR or a REAP grant or both. This lovely barn here is the Ferrandino farm. They got a new maple syrup evaporator and reverse osmosis machine. They received over $30,000 in a combination from MDAR and REAP, which left them with only about $10,000 left of that project to cover themselves. So they did a really good, financially. So these are the different grants that I am the most knowledgeable about and that we're going to talk about today. We're not really going to cover the Mass Farm Energy grants. I just want you to know that they exist. They're very simple and they're all handled exclusively through me, so you don't need a whole webinar on them. So first is the USDA, which is the United States Department of Agriculture. They run the REAP grant, so it's a federal grant on the national level, and not each state individually, but there's some states that have their own REAP program and some are together. So for us, it's Massachusetts, Connecticut, and Rhode Island. Each state has its own pot of money, though, so you'll only be competing with other farms in Massachusetts. And the coordinator for that is Ann Correa at the USDA and Jonathan Burns. I have their contact info at the end of the webinar, so you'll be able to have that. If you have any complicated questions, I usually either ask them or send people directly to them. There's also the Massachusetts Department of Agriculture, or MDAR. A lot of you have either heard of or worked with this. Specifically, the person who administers this grant is Jerry Polano. I know that name is going to sound familiar to a lot of people. And then there's the Mass Farm Energy Program, which is me, or MFEP. MFEP has a little bit of money to help farms with projects, up to $4,000, so it's a lot less than the other grants, but it can help people who wouldn't qualify for other things or who just need a little bit of help. And we also help cover audits, which I will talk about more later, but just know that there is funding available to help pay for audits. The REAP applications already exist. You can get them from me. I'm not sure if they're on the REAP website, but I can send them out. The MDR applications haven't come out yet. Jerry assured me they would be out by the end of February. We're about halfway through February, so we'll see. But they don't exist yet. You can't look at it because you can only look at last year's and they'll probably change. I do have a notification list of people that I'm going to email when the applications come out. If you want to be added to that list, just shoot me an email after this webinar. I'll put you on the list and then you'll know the second they come out. So first we're going to talk about the Rural Energy for America program because it's more complicated and it's good to get it out of the way first. Here you can see a ground-mounted solar electric array. This is at Honey Pot Farm in Hatfield. They received over $27,000 in grant money, which covered more than half of the cost of the project. So the first thing to know about REAP that everyone wants to know is how much money can I get? And the answer is 25% of your eligible project costs. So it's determined on almost an individual basis which costs are eligible. Typically, anything that's directly related to the project is eligible. So if you're putting solar PV on a roof, say, all the costs associated with installing it, with hooking it up, are eligible. If in the course of that you find that you have to make the roof stronger in order to support the weight of the solar, some of that might be eligible, some of it might not. That's something that you probably have to talk about with the USDA. And that's just an example of things that can be eligible and ineligible. You can see I've listed some minimum and maximum grant requests. I don't run into this too often, but if you have a very, very small or a very, very large project, you want to make sure the project costs at least $10,000 and not more than $2 million. I have never had a farm have a project cost more than $2 million. If you do, I would love to talk to you. So you apply for 25% of your cost. So if your project's $100,000, you can apply for $25,000. REAPs, or the USDA will sometimes prorate the grants. You won't necessarily get the whole thing that you've applied for, but that doesn't happen too often. I do also want to mention there are two different kinds of REAP grants. You can see there's renewable energy systems. So if you see RES in the presentation, that's all it means is renewable energy systems. That's things like solar, wind, biomass, I think. There's a list in a minute we'll get to. And then energy efficiency improvements, which is when you're improving something you already have. So like adding insulation so there's less heat loss. The maple syrup evaporators that I mentioned, that's efficiency because it's a more efficient evaporator. Those have slightly different grant totals, as you can see. And you can actually apply for both of them. So you can submit one renewable energy and one energy efficiency. So I do have a farm we'll talk about a little bit later who did a solar project and a variable speed drive, or a VSD. He was able to submit one application for both types. You can only do one application per type per round. So you wouldn't be able to submit, say, a solar project and then like a solar hot water project at the same time. It's not allowed. There are also 3 different sizes of REAP grants. There's small, medium, and large. This round that we're in right now, the spring round, is unrestricted, so it's any size grant. So the applications can be small, medium, or large, and you can apply for pretty much any amount of money. That's 25% of what you have, but it doesn't have a cap. The fall round is restricted, so the total project cost is only allowed to be $80,000. And the maximum amount of money you can ask for in the fall is $20,000, which is 25% of $80,000. If you happen to have a project that's over 80 and you really want to apply in the fall, you still can, but you still can't ask for more than 20,000. So it's going to be a smaller proportion of what you. It's going to be less than 25% of your total project costs. So here's an example of some eligible project costs. You can see that some things that are eligible are equipment, but it does have to be new or refurbished. And something I do want to note is the post-application construction. So any work that you've done before you apply is not an eligible cost. So if you've dug a trench already or started building something, it won't be an eligible cost. It has to be after the application. And that's because they do have to make sure that you're not violating any federal or state laws and that it's environmentally sound before they agree to fund it. I'm not going to read you guys the whole slides. You guys can all read. But you can see that something else that's good to look at is a second meter. We'll talk about this a little bit more later, but if you need to put in a second meter because of your renewable energy project, that is an eligible cost. Things that are ineligible are residential energy projects. A lot of times farms have a farm building and a residence on the same meter or hooked into the same grid. This is why you might need a second meter, because residential costs are not going to be covered. You can't use the grant for any kind of vehicles or equipment, and not for any other of the things that are listed on here, which again, it doesn't come up that often. You also can't cover your own in-kind labor. So if you are oh, my labor's valued at this much, that's a cost I'm going to use as part of the project cost. That doesn't count. Your own in-kind isn't eligible. A third-party in-kind cost might be eligible, but only up to about 10%. And I just want to mention that because it's in my notes, but it really doesn't come up that often. Most costs are pretty straightforward. It's the cost of a solar panel, an electrician to hook it up, the mounting, the wiring, normal things. Here's an example of some eligible technologies. This isn't all the technologies that are eligible for a REAP grant, but this is a good portion of them. You can see under efficiency, it's things like lighting, heating, cooling, fans, controls, insulation. Renewable, there's solar, wind, electric, biomass, anaerobic digesters, what I was trying to think of earlier. I do want to highlight solar because that is by far the most popular project that I fill out grants for. I would say almost every REAP grant I did last round was for solar electric. It's extremely popular. It gets funded a lot. It's something a lot of people are into. Do just note that the technology has to be commercially available, so you can't do anything that's experimental or that you have invented. It has to have a warranty and a service provider to back it up, which again does not come up that often. Most people are just sort of getting something that they can buy and they work with a contractor, and it's usually not a problem. So who's eligible for REAP? Hopefully everyone on this webinar, because that's what we want to see. In order to be eligible for REAP, you can sort of qualify in two different ways. One way is by being an agricultural producer. Hopefully most of you fit this definition, but you don't have to. That means that you receive 51% or more of your gross income from agricultural production. So that includes growing crops, raising animals, aquaculture, forestry, nurseries, dairies, all kinds of things. And the way they determine whether you are getting 51% or more of your income is by your federal tax returns. So as part of the REAP application, you will have to submit your past 3 years of federal tax returns, which we'll get to when we talk about components of an application, but that is something to keep in mind. If by chance you haven't been in business for 3 years, it doesn't preclude you from applying, but you do have to have some sort of projection, usually from an accountant, that shows what you expect your taxes to be to make up the 3 years. So like if you've been in business for 2 years, you'd have those two, and then you'd project out the 3rd year. You can also be a rural small business. So it's called the Rural Energy for America program. So if you're a small business that's not an ag producer, you can still qualify if you're in a rural area. So the rural area is determined by the USDA based off a map, which I have linked to here, but I'm not going to open because I'm going to mess up my PowerPoint if I do. But if someone wants to see it at the end, we can certainly look at that. Where you basically just put your address in, and it will pop up a little box to you that says this is an eligible address or it's not. And that lets you know if you can qualify that way. Sometimes if farms have a lot of income from different sources other than the farm, it's easier for them to qualify as a small business than an ag producer. If you are a farm, you don't have to be an ag producer. You can qualify as a small business. There's absolutely no difference in the way you get into the program. Like one isn't valued over the other. It doesn't matter. And rural small business also, when people are like, what's rural? Rural is a city with less than 50,000 in population that is also not contiguous or adjacent to a city with more than 50,000 in population. But really just use the USDA map. Just put your stuff in and look at it. Something else that's come up a couple of times is nonprofits. If you're running a nonprofit, you can apply for REAP, but only as an ag producer, since you're obviously not a business, you're a nonprofit. So if you're a nonprofit and you want to apply, you do have to meet that 51% rule. So what is a small business? It can be a co-op, it can be a partnership, it can be an LLC, any of those things. But you will typically, as a small business or as a farm, have a NAICS code. So that's NAICS. That's the North American Industry Classification System. I've taken a screenshot of the document just so you can see an example. This document's like 50 pages long. It's huge. And it has a size standard for every type of business or farm you can imagine. So I've taken one under crop production. This is by far not all the crop productions that are listed. This is just a tiny, tiny section. And so this number, the NAICS code, is on your federal tax forms. It'll be on your Schedule F if you're a farm. And they always look like these numbers on the side here on the left. They're like 6 or 7 digits. They usually start with a bunch of ones. And that goes through all the things you're growing. So if you're a corn farmer, which I doubt anyone is, but still, so the size standard to be considered a small business is $750,000. As you can see, all of these are, most of them are $750,000. Some of them, I think, for like cattle ranching are a lot bigger. But typically that's the size standard. And I very rarely meet a farm that isn't considered small under that. Most of them are. But if you're applying as an ag producer, it doesn't really matter. You don't necessarily have to be small. You're just an ag producer. If you're applying as a small business, you have to be under that. There are other ways to determine your size. If you can't find or don't have a NAICS code, you can take the average income for the past 3 years or your number of employees. A lot of farms I work with have like 2 employees, so they're definitely small. I don't hit a lot of barriers with this, but it is something to keep in mind to make sure that you qualify as small if you're applying as a small business. So now we're going to go through the REAP application, all the bits and pieces that you need. It's going to sound really complicated, but I promise it's not that bad. I've been doing this for about 4.5 years now. I've done a lot of them. I've seen a lot of things. And if I haven't seen it, and if the USDA has, so whatever question you have, someone can answer. This is a beautiful long-distance picture of a roof-mounted solar PV at Littlebrook Farm in Sunderland. They got, again, about $28,000, which was about 75% of the total cost. So they were able to do that without having to put in too much of their own money. So these are all the components of an application. So there's going to be the application document itself, which is a PDF that I have. And then these are all the bits of supporting information that you need to put in as well. So you need to have a contractor proposal. You'll need to say, this is a licensed qualified contractor who's going to install my solar or my reverse osmosis machine or whatever it is. That will need to include a budget breakdown that shows exactly how much everything's going to cost. So rather than just a lump sum, you need to have a breakout of the cost for labor, the cost for parts, the cost for permitting, the cost for like interconnection. Just needs to be basically an itemized invoice. And then you also, they recently have been requesting cut sheets, which is sort of a technical industry term for just the specifications on your equipment. So it almost looks like a blueprint drawing, but it's not like big or on blueprint paper, where it shows the size and the depths and like what the stuff does. Most contractors will have that without any sort of issue. That's a thing that might even be in their proposal. As I mentioned, you need your past 3 years of tax returns. You may or may not need to have an energy audit or energy assessment. We're going to talk about that on the very next slide in more detail. And as you can see, I put commitment of funds in red. This is by far the most important thing. So the REAP grant only covers 25% of the cost. You need to be able to demonstrate to the USDA that you can cover the additional 75% in any way that you're planning on doing it. So if you're taking out a loan, you need a loan statement. If you're applying for other grants, preferably they would like you to have the award letter from the other grant, but since the grant sort of runs concurrently, you can just sort of say like, yeah, I applied for this other one. If you have the money yourself, they'll want to see a bank statement showing that you have that much in the bank. Any way that you can show, yes, I swear I have the other 75%, I will be able to pay it. If you have a project that costs more than $200,000, you have to have a feasibility study. Feasibility studies are much more in-depth and much more expensive than an audit or an assessment. They're a big time commitment and they cost quite a bit of money. So if you have a large project, please let me know ASAP so we can get that started. And if there's any way to keep it under $200,000, I would recommend that because it takes a whole other level of stuff. There's also a bunch of supplemental forms. We're going to talk about a couple of those, but they are all included in the application package. And then there's an environmental form, which they redid last year and which we are also going to talk about in more detail. In addition to that, you need your federal ID numbers. One more time, we're going to talk about those. I'm going to go through a lot of this. So there's a DUNS number and a SAM code. I have like 2 or 3 slides on this. We're going to get to it. And I will be happy to walk through this whole process with you. Just so you know, I have done this a bunch of times. I'm happy to go through it with you. There are also instructions in the application PDF, but they're a little bit, hard to get into. If you've ever read instructions for like preparing your taxes or sort of similar to that, where they don't make a lot of sense, but I can kind of help you get through them all. So do you need an audit or an assessment? I mentioned that you might or might not. If you're doing an energy efficiency application, so if you are doing something where you're saying, I'm currently using this much energy, and when I install this new thing, I'm going to use this much less. So a more efficient evaporator, insulation, upgrading the lighting, something like that, you absolutely need an audit. You have to have some kind of study or assessment that demonstrates how much energy you're saving, because you can't just say, yeah, I'm saving 10,000 kilowatt hours. You need to be able to like show that. If you get an audit, it will qualify for any project size. If you're just getting an assessment, it qualifies for only projects under 200,000. The difference is that an assessment is typically targeted towards one project or one piece of equipment. Sometimes they're called targeted audits. So if you're replacing your lighting, they like only look at the lighting and nothing else. They're typically cheaper. An audit is more comprehensive. Will cover your entire energy use as a business or a farm. So any energy that you're using for anything, they'll audit that. This is an important distinction, especially because audits are required for the MDAR grant, as you'll hear shortly. So you want to make sure you have the right kind of audit or assessment. However, for REAP, if you're doing renewable energy, so if you're doing solar or biomass or like a heat recovery system, you don't need an audit because you're not trying to demonstrate that what you're using is less, what you're putting in is going to use less energy than what you have. So you won't need an audit for solar or anything else renewable, unless, as I mentioned, it's over $200,000, then you need a feasibility study. So how do you get an audit? As I alluded to earlier, the Mass Farm Energy Program has audit assistance. We can cover up to 75% of the cost of an audit. I also have an engineering partner that the Mass Farm Energy Program works with that we can refer you to. You don't have to use our engineering partner. You can absolutely use any qualified engineer. There's a list of qualifications. If you want to use your own engineer, make sure you run it by me first if you're applying for Mass Farm Energy money, and we'll make sure they meet the qualifications so that we are allowed to fund them. Typically what will happen is the auditor will give you a cost proposal before you commit to the audit. So they'll write up a proposal about what they're going to do and how much it's going to cost. Then you'll also see the Mass Farm Energy application, how much we're going to cover before you have to commit to anything. So you can kind of see all the finances before you have to say, yes, I'm absolutely going to do this audit. And it is a cost share. So you're only ever responsible for 25% of the audit cost, and Mass Farm will pay the rest directly to the auditor, so you don't have to get reimbursed. This is a very personal and different amount of money for every farm, but I would say typically farm shares are between $500 and $800 for an audit, and MSEP covers the rest. You can use the same audit for both the REAP and the MDAR grants, and if you go all the way and get an Ag EMP, which is an Agricultural Energy Management Plan, it's a little fancier, it costs a little more, but that one is also accepted by MRCS, which I'm totally blanking on what that stands for, but they have a little bit more stringent requirements, but you don't have to do that for the REAP grant. There are also other places that can help fund audits sometimes. I've had people get audit funding from CISA, which is Community Involved in Sustainable Agriculture. It's sort of a more local farming thing. And NRCS has also provided some audit funding. And sometimes they can be combined. It's really on a case-by-case basis. So if you're interested in this, just hit me up and we'll see what we can do. All right, so let's get into the very exciting federal grant numbers. I mentioned earlier that in order to apply for REAP, you need a DUNS number. DUNS is the Dun and Bradstreet Universal Numbering System, and it's a copyrighted means of identifying business entities on a location-specific basis, which is a long way of saying it's basically like an ID number for your business. They're provided 100% free of charge. If anyone ever says to you that you have to pay to get a DUNS number, they are lying to you. Don't ever pay for anything to do with a DUNS number. They're free all the time. If anything seems shady or someone's saying that you owe them money, please let me know and I will yell at them. Okay, I haven't actually yelled at anyone, but I have told people that they're scamming. They're relatively easy to get. You just go online to this website that I've linked from here and fill out some information about your farm. A lot of farms and a lot of businesses already have one, even if they don't know it. When you file, like to start a business with the state of Massachusetts, you're usually assigned a DUNS number, even if you don't know it or it was so long ago that you don't know what it is. You can typically look it up, and then you can just log into the system, make sure all your information's up to date, and then you've got one. I have written that it can take up to 6 weeks to get a DUNS number. That's like, it usually does not take that long. Usually people can log in and see it right away. 6 weeks is like the maximum that it can take to get this. That has only happened a couple of times when there's been a problem where someone either had to start from scratch or they like changed the name of their business or something and there was like a problem in the system. Hopefully it doesn't take that long, but it is something you should look at right away so that you know if it's going to be a problem or if you've already got it. So that's something you can start at the very beginning of the application process, is like, look this up, find out. The other important number is SAM. So SAM is the System for Award Management, and it's called a CAGE code or a SAM CAGE code. They're all the same thing. This is something that the federal government specifically uses to make sure of two things. One, that your business is in compliance with all federal laws, that you don't have any unpaid taxes, stuff like that, because they're not going to give you grant money if you're like violating the law. And also, it's what they use to actually distribute the grant. So when you apply They will ask you for your bank information and your direct deposit information, because when they send you the grant, that's how it's going to be done. It's distributed through the SAM system. So when you are applying and they ask you for like your routing number, that is normal. It's exactly the same as setting up direct deposit with an employer. They're just going to send you the money directly from there. You can only get a SAM once you have a DUNS number, so you need to get a DUNS number first. It's a two-step process, by which I mean you have to log into SAM and create an account, and then after you've created the account, you have to register an entity, which will be your business or your farm. A lot of people are like, okay, I created the account, I'm done, and it's like, no, you don't have the code, like you have to keep going. This can take a little while to process. This one typically takes longer than the DUNS. The most frequent holdup with this is that the information you enter doesn't match what's entered into the DUNS system exactly, and I mean exactly, like spelling out the word street and like not putting a period at the end of it, like ridiculous stuff. It has to match exactly. If it doesn't match, then it creates all these errors. If it matches, then it comes back pretty quickly. So SAM is a 5-digit code. It's got some numbers and letters in it, and it will have an expiration date. So they last for about a year. In fact, I think they last exactly a year, and then they have to be renewed. I can't say this enough. SAM is, again, absolutely 100% free. It's free to apply. It's free to renew. It's a free number. There's a very common scam that I've unfortunately run into a bunch of times where people will get an email that says, oh, pay us $500 to renew your SAM code. It's not real. Totally ignore it. They do have to be renewed, but it doesn't cost any money. All you have to do to renew it is just log into the site and certify that all your contact information is the same. Like, they just want to keep it up to date. That's it. It doesn't cost any money, and it never will. So the other thing is, because there are so many frequent scams and because people were like doing weird stuff in the system, to apply for a SAM code now requires you to get a notarized letter. There is a letter template on their website, and you just have to sort of fill in the blanks with your information, but then you do have to get it notarized. And it essentially just asserts that you are who you say you are this business, and you are going to do business with the federal government, and that's why you want this number. This is another thing you should do as soon as you can. So as soon as you get the DUNS number, you can start applying for the SAM, and I would do that as soon as you can. So another thing, again, that I'm happy to help with. The federal government, I want to say like 2 months ago, changed the SAM website, so I'm not as familiar with it as I used to be, but I would be happy to walk you through the application process. So this is a screenshot of the first page of the environmental information form. This is a different way of gathering information. I'm sorry, I take that back. There are two environmental forms now. There's one that looks like an Excel document that is in the application package PDF that I can send. That one asks you like a bunch of questions about if you're going to be near a wetland or disturb an endangered species or dig up the ground, like a bunch of things to make sure you're not violating any federal laws or you're going to bump into any federal regulations. Most people don't have a problem with that, but one of the new requirements is an aerial map of the project location. That's typically pretty easy to get. You can use Google Earth, Google Maps. Sometimes if your town has an assessor's database, you can use that to get an aerial map. It's not that difficult. We just have to remember to do it. And the other thing is the SHPO form. That's what this is a screenshot of. This is a screenshot of the State Historic Preservation Office form, which is something else new, or it was new last round, so it's relatively new to REAP. If there's a project that's going to involve ground disturbance, so if you're like trenching for a solar thing, or if you're digging up to put a foundation in for something, that's ground disturbance, or if you're in a historic district or building on a building that's more than 50 years old. If you meet any of those, you need to fill out this form and send it into the State Historic Preservation Office so they can approve your project. If you don't do that, the USDA will do it on your behalf, but that can take a lot longer because they have a lot of other stuff going on, and it can take a lot longer for them to get processed. And so if it doesn't come back in time for the grant awards, you might not get the grant. So you want to get this done ahead of time. This doesn't have to be submitted with the application. In fact, it shouldn't be because it's going to a different office. I think the office is in Boston. It's not going in with the REAP application. So you want to fill this out and you want to send it in. You can do that anytime, even if your application isn't complete yet, because it's really just asking you about your plans for the project. Now I'm going to go over just a few extremely common questions that I've gotten from people over the years. Hopefully this will answer some of your own questions. This is a nice picture of a brand new evaporator at Steve's Sugar Shack in West Hampton. Their project was actually completely funded. They were able to secure all the $33,000 that they needed to do it from a combination of REAP and MDAR grants, so that worked out really, really well for them. First question, do I have to own the land that I do the project on? So a lot of people are either renting land or they're renting part of their farm, and the answer is no, you don't have to own it, but you do have to control it. So that means that you either have to have a lease agreement that demonstrates a long-term legal right to use the property, which is typically not less than 3 years, so a 3-year or more lease agreement, and the project that you're proposing has to be allowed under the terms of the lease. So you basically have to get the landowner to be like, yeah, this is cool. Sometimes the agreement is either good for the lifetime of the equipment, or if, say, it's a reverse osmosis machine, if you move, if you stop leasing this land, the equipment has to go with you. You can't leave it there because it was funded with federal grant money. It has to stay attached to you. Another question I talked about earlier is what if I only have 1 meter? As I said, solar is an extremely popular project. A lot of farms have a single meter for their home and for their farm. If you only have 1 meter, you have 2 options. You can either get an audit that does a load calculation. So a load calculation or a load analysis is basically when an engineer teases out how much electricity your home or residence is using and how much is being used by the farm or the business. And then what will happen when you do that is you'll have to prorate the project. So you basically have to say, what size would this project need to be if it was only going to go to the farm? So if it was only going to, if it was going to need to be the size it was to fund the electricity that's only for the farm, how much would that project cost? And so those become your eligible project costs. So you can still do the huge whole project that covers both electric use by the residents and the farm, but you can't apply for 25% of that complete cost. I realize that's sort of confusing. If you find yourself in this situation, it's easier to talk about with specifics than in a general way. The other thing is, if you do that load analysis and you find that like a very small amount of energy is going to the farm and most of it's going to the residents, it's probably not going to get funded. REAP really doesn't like to fund residential projects. So you really need to demonstrate that the majority of the energy use, it's typically got to be 50% or more, is the farm. Otherwise, it's not going to score very well. It's probably not going to get funded. Your other option is you can put in a second meter. So you can break out your farm from your residence. You can just get a second meter installed, and that is an eligible cost. So you can throw the cost of that into the project cost that you're applying for 25% of. This one also comes up a lot. Can I build a new structure? Typically, the answer is no. So you usually can't use a REAP grant to build a completely new barn or building or whatever, unless you're in the very specific box where the building you're building is being used for the exact same purpose as an existing building, and based on your energy on it, it will be more cost effective to build a whole new one than to improve the existing building. So that's the only time when new construction is eligible under REAP. It's really not what the program is for. So let's talk about scoring. I've been mentioning that your application might not score well under certain situations. REAP does not keep your scoring a secret. You're going to see in a second exactly how many points everything is worth. This picture is of Red Shirt Farm in Lanesboro. They got over $36,000 in a total of REAP and MDAR grants, which was a very high proportion of their cost. And you can see it's a very nice roof-mounted solar. So here's all the points for REAP. I'm going to go through these, not with a fine-tooth comb, but you can see, I can't remember what these all add up to. 10, 25, 30, 50, 60, 70, yeah, 100. Okay, it adds up to 100 points. That makes sense. So you can see how the points are broken out. BTU per grant dollar. BTU stands for British Thermal Unit. It's just a common unit that you can convert everything else into. So in order for the USDA to compare projects across different fuel types, so like one project saving kilowatt hours, one saving therms, one saving cords of wood, they convert them all into BTUs so that they can compare them more easily. So you want to have the most BTUs per grant dollar. So you want to say like, yeah, my project is saving a ton of energy and it's not going to cost a ton of money. This is somewhat subjective because they're going to compare it to the other people who apply in your round. So you won't necessarily know how well it's going to stack up. You won't know how well it's going to stack up next to whoever else applies because you'll be able to see all their applications. But in general, you'll be able to know, like, yeah, my BTU for grant dollar is pretty high. Also, energy replaced, saved, or generated. So you want to be doing either great energy efficiency or a renewable energy project that saves or produces a lot of energy. You don't want to produce, if you're doing renewables, especially solar, you don't want to produce too much more energy than what your farm needs. They try not to encourage people to install a ton of solar and then sell the electricity. They want you to be using it on your farm. What are the environmental benefits of your project? You can see that's not worth a ton of points, but obviously anything that's producing energy or reducing energy use is going to be good for the environment. I highlighted again in red commitment of funds. This is worth the most points. This is once more showing that you can cover the 75% of costs that the grant doesn't cover. The more funds you have, the ability to show, like the more documentation you have, the better. Like you absolutely positively want to be able to show that you can cover the remaining 75%. Size of the ag producer or small business, this is not something you really have control over. Smaller is better, so if you're a really small farm or a really small business, you get more points. But again, it's somewhat relative to who else is applying in that round. If you're a previous grantee or borrower, if you are a previous REAP grantee, you get fewer points. They like to give funding out to people who haven't received grants before. The simple payback, which is basically how long it's going to take the project to pay for itself. Shorter is better, so you want the project to save enough money that it will pay for itself within relatively few years. For the MFEP funds, I know things have to have an 8-year payback or lower in order to be funded. REAP doesn't have that kind of designation, but shorter is better. And then there are state director admin points. These aren't really a priority, but it's something that can sort of be a tiebreaker if two applications are pretty much the same. That's sort of at the discretion of people who are grading the USDA. I'm sorry, it's at the discretion of people grading the REAP application, so it's the USDA employees. Points can be awarded for an underrepresented technology, which is basically anything but solar. Solar's very well represented, but if it's something more obscure, you get more points. Geographic diversity, so if a REAP grant's never been awarded in this particular town that you're in, which again, you would really have no way of knowing. So these aren't things you really have control over, but I did want you to know what they are. If it's an underserved population, so veterans, minority-owned, and women-owned businesses are underserved. And if it meets a presidential initiative, there are a lot of presidential initiatives. The most common one is local foods, so you can get more points for being part of like a local food movement, or if you're in a poverty area, which is again something USDA has a map of. It's not something you can control, like your farm is where it is. But I do just want you to know it's not like a mystery. USDA is very open about what the points are for and how many go in each thing. So something I'm also wanting to talk about is some of the barriers to getting funding. So the USDA always lets me know who got funding and who didn't, and then sometimes they have reasons why people weren't funded. So the first reason is just it didn't score as well as the other applicants in that round. The lowest one I've ever seen funded has 43 points. That's just to give you an idea of how many points you're kind of shooting for. But again, it's somewhat subjective because if everyone has like 43 points in that round, then the person with 45 is going to be great. But typically you want to have more points. If your DUNS and SAM numbers don't come through by the time they make the grant awards, they won't award them to you. You absolutely have to have the SAM number before they make the grant awards, because they can't give out money to someone that they haven't been able to verify is in compliance with the laws. Incomplete documentation. If you don't have all the bits and pieces, they will ask you, like, you get a chance. If you submit it, you think you have everything, and they're like, oh, you're missing X, Y, or Z, they will ask you for it. If you never send it in, then you don't get funded. Like, you have to have all the parts of your application. And I typically will make checklists for the farms that I work with that shows everything they need, and I make sure that they have it, or at least I try. If they're oversubscribed, this is the one thing that you do not have any control over. So there's only so much money. I'm going to make up a number. I don't know what the grant is, but if there's only $100,000 and enough farms apply that there's like $200,000 worth of grant money, not everyone is going to get it. That's just how it is. That's why they're scoring, and that's why you want to score higher. Because if there is too much money, if there's too much request and not enough money, it's called being oversubscribed, and they just can't give money they don't have. And the last one is if there's not enough commercial usage. So that's what I was sort of mentioning, where if you have a single meter or you're all together a residence in a farm and not enough of the energy is going to the farm or the business, it's not going to get funded. How do you submit the application? So the deadline for this round is April 1st, 2019. Typically, the deadline is March 31st, but March 31st is a Sunday this year, so they pushed it off to April 1st, and that is not a joke. Applications do have to be submitted hard copy, so you can't email them or fax them or scan them. You need to submit the original hard copy version. It has to be sent to, it doesn't have to be sent. It can be mailed or delivered by hand to any of the USDA rural offices in Massachusetts. That green section there is a link to all of those offices. I believe there are 4 of them. They're somewhat scattered across the state. Not most of them. They're a little bit more heavily concentrated in the east towards Boston, but there is one in Amherst, and you can also mail it. So you can mail it anywhere. They must be received by 4:30 on the deadline date, which is April 1st. So you want to make sure if you mail it, that you mail it with plenty of time. The USDA will occasionally ask people to email a copy of the application forms, which just helps them process it more quickly, but that doesn't count as a submission. That's something they ask for sort of after the fact. You won't get any of your documentation back, so don't submit your actual tax returns. Those you should make a copy of, because you don't get anything back. Once you send it to them, it's gone forever. And so then the USDA will review your application for completeness. They'll send you an email that says, yeah, we got your application and you're good, or we got it and we still need this and this. And then they'll score your project. The first thing they do is they look at the environmental review and make sure that it passes that. There is a waiver you can sign with REAP where if it passes the environmental review, you can start construction before you know if you've got the award or not. Otherwise, you need to wait until you've been notified whether you got the grant or not in order to begin construction, or else you become ineligible. I think I mentioned everything. Oh, and there is a fall deadline. The fall deadline is October 31st for the restricted round. So if you don't think you can make it into the spring round, if you don't have your stuff together, or you just want to wait till the fall, that's fine. I'll probably be running the same webinar in, I don't know, like September, to talk about the smaller round, but it's going to be a lot of the same information. The other thing is you can submit your application anytime. So if you are ready, if you have all your stuff together, you don't have to wait for the deadline. You can submit it now, and they'll be able to review it and make sure that you have all the bits and pieces. It can be good to submit it early because you can have a little bit more time to go back and forth and make sure you have everything. After you submit and are funded, if you're funded, there are reporting requirements. I am not involved in this process. I really don't know anything about the reporting requirements except that they exist. Reporting starts the first year after construction. For efficiency projects, it's for 2 years. For renewable energy, it's for 3 years. All of this should be in the grant award package. So if you're awarded the grant, you'll get a package that explains everything you're going to need to do before you say whether you want to accept the grant or not. And if you have questions about this, I typically direct people directly to the USDA because I honestly don't know. I'm strictly application help. Okay, that's everything for the REAP grant. I've seen a bunch of questions pop up. I swear I'm going to get to them at the end. So just keep typing them in and we will come back to them. Now we're going to talk about the MDAR grant. You're going to hear some of the same information, but the MDAR grant is a lot more straightforward and a little less involved than REAP, so this part should go a little faster. I know we've all been here for a while, and I appreciate all of you sticking with me. This is Mountain View Farm in East Hampton. They were awarded a little under 50% of the project costs. This was a pretty big project, so the MDAR grant was a flat amount, as you're going to see in a minute, but they still got about half of it, so that was still really good for them. And go to the next one, please. Okay, so MDAR grant assistance. Unlike REAP, which is a proportion, MDAR is flat $30,000. That's the maximum you can ask for no matter what your project costs. You can't ask for more than your project costs. If your project only costs $20,000, you can't ask for 30. They're not going to just give you money. Much like REAP, you have to wait for funding notification before beginning work. This does not have a waiver. You absolutely have to wait until you've been notified by MDAR in order to begin construction. The MDAR grant last year was due at the end of April. Notifications were made in about September or October. I expect it to be on the same schedule this year. They don't have firm dates, but the notifications will probably be made sometime in the fall. So if you're applying for this, keep in mind that you won't be able to begin construction until the fall. Unlike REAP, which had different size applications, there's only one MDAR application for all project sizes and types, so you only got to have one PDF to deal with. There's something called special projects, which we're going to talk about more in a little bit. Those are on the same application as the regular MDAR projects, and there's only one round per year. So rather than a spring and a fall round, there are 2 rounds. I'm sorry, rather than there being 2 rounds, there's only one. It's every spring. It doesn't have a firm deadline, but it's in the spring. And there's only one, so you got 1 shot per year. The other thing I wanted to mention, I think this is apparent, but I want to say it, both REAP and MDAR are reimbursable grants, which means you have to have the money up front and then you receive the grant money after. So you will have to like put in a investment or spend some capital ahead of time, and then when you get the grant, you get that money paid back to you, but it is a reimbursement. So who's eligible for MDAR? It's one thing to just say farms. Obviously farms are eligible, but there's some little bitty definitions that get weird in there. So the applicant has to be significantly commercially involved in agriculture. So if you're just growing stuff for yourself and you're not selling it, that doesn't count. You're not commercially involved. If you have if you have a farm, it has to meet like a certain standard. It's a little bit subjective, so if you feel like you're not sure if you count as a farm, we can run it by Jerry at MDAR and we'll figure it out. The other thing I highlighted, so this is the legal definition of farming in Massachusetts, and I've linked to the full law about it. But the other thing that comes up sometimes is horse farms. So if you are keeping horses as a commercial enterprise, so not just for fun, but if you're like providing riding lessons and like showing horses, something that's generating an income, that does count as a farm, even though you're not, so to speak, growing the horses. And so what kind of projects are eligible for MDAR? It's basically going to be anything that's energy efficient or renewable energy. All the stuff that was listed at the beginning for the REAP application, that's all still eligible. Anything that saves energy or produces energy. If you think that your project is like in a strange category and might not be eligible, just ask and we'll figure it out. There will be a full list of all the different options that will be in the MDAR grant when it comes out. I could have listed them all from last year's grant, but it would have taken up like a million slides. So what I did is I took a screenshot of just the special projects. So in addition to your basic energy efficiency and renewable energy projects, MDAR also has something called special projects. So these are certain technologies or projects that they want to promote or they want people to do. And they vary from year to year, so they're not exactly the same, but these are last year's, just to give you an idea. You can also see that they award different amounts of money than the flat $30,000, so the special projects have different funding. There was heat recovery anaerobic digesters. One of the more popular ones is high efficiency walk-in coolers. So MDAR was seeing a lot of farms who had sort of jerry-rigged coolers or were using residential refrigerators, and it was just not great. So they made a special project category for putting in a new efficient walk-in cooler or freezer, which isn't necessarily going to use less energy than what you're currently using, but it's going to be better for the business overall. The other one that came up a lot was either zero net energy greenhouses or super efficient new building. So when I said that you couldn't build a new building under REAP, you can under MDAR, provided that it's super efficient. And there are a lot more details in the actual application about what makes it super efficient. So if that's something that you're looking into, we'll make sure that it ticks off all the boxes. And I don't see dual use solar, but one thing that has been on here before was ground-mounted solar with either crop growing or grazing underneath it, so dual-use solar. It looks like that wasn't on here last year. We'll see if it is this year. So let's go through the MDAR application. This is going to take a lot less time than the REAP one, I promise. This is a very nice solar PV at Wilder Hill Gardens in Conway. They got about half of their project funded by MDAR. They unfortunately weren't funded by REAP because they didn't have all the things they needed for it, but it doesn't matter. They still have some funding and put the project up, and it's lovely. So the components of a MDAR application are significantly fewer than of a REAP application. You will, again, need the application PDF itself, which as soon as it comes out, I will let you guys know. You will need a proposal, again, from a contractor, whoever, showing what you're going to install, how much it's going to cost, how much energy it's going to save. For MDAR, you have to have an audit. If you're doing energy efficiency, renewable energy, whatever it is, doesn't matter, an audit is required. And that will include a load analysis, breaking out residential and commercial if necessary. MDAR, much like REAP, also waives commitment of funds documentation. So exactly the same as REAP, if you have, say, a $50,000 project, you're applying for a $30,000 grant, you need to demonstrate to MDAR, yeah, I have this other $20,000. I'm going to get a solar loan. I have it in my bank account. It's buried in the backyard, something that shows you have the money. And then any other supplemental documentation that helps back up what you're doing. Sometimes there could be like a project site or, I'm sorry, a picture of the project site, or sometimes people will submit, because they're applying for both grants, like all the stuff they submitted for REAP. It's not necessary, but it can help. You'll notice that MDAR is not asking for your tax returns. You don't need the federal ID numbers because as the M in MDAR stands for Massachusetts, this is a state grant only, so you don't need those federal identification numbers. And the package will be much smaller. Do I need an audit? Yes. Yes, you do, or demonstrate the initiation or commitment for such. So, for instance, there's 24 people listening to me right now. If you all need audits and you all want to use my auditing partner, they're probably not all going to get done before the MDAR deadline because there's just only so many people who can do things. If you have a commitment, so a signed acceptance letter or a signed service agreement with the auditor where it's like, look, we couldn't get this done by the deadline, but it's definitely happening, I've committed to it, MDAR will take that into account and they'll count that towards you rather than against you. I'm going to go over some common questions for the MDAR application as well. They don't have a scoring sheet the way REAP does. I don't know exactly how their stuff is scored, but I don't have the scoring sheet for it, so we can't go over that. But I do know that they tend to give funding to as many people as they possibly can, and it is somewhat of a negotiation. Like if you apply for $30,000, you may get a call that says, hey, could you take 25? And then they have more money to give to other people. So it's a little bit more malleable. This is some construction and finished pictures of Justimere Tree Farm in Worthington. They actually built a zero net energy maple kitchen. So you can see there's like a sink and there's some shelves for their maple bottling. And it was zero net energy partially because it had a solar array on the roof. So they received a ton of money from MDAR from special projects. And they also received some money for REAP, which was strictly for the solar array and not for the construction, because it was new construction, wasn't eligible for REAP, but they were able to apply for the solar portion, so that was really good. So for MDAR, can you build a new structure? As I just mentioned, you can under special projects. You can build a zero net energy building, or I think it was a hyper efficient greenhouse. Like, there are certain very specific buildings you can build. But under the basic ag energy grant, it's not eligible. If you aren't looking at building zero net energy or a fancy greenhouse, there are other MDAR grants. There's farm viability, which is something you can apply for if what you're doing will make your farm more economically viable. And there's a couple of other grant options. So if you talk to me, I can help point you in the right direction. I unfortunately don't have as much experience filling out those applications, so I'll probably send you somewhere else for help, but I at least know what they are. Something else that comes up with Massachusetts farms is, what if I have APR? So APR is an agricultural preservation restriction, which basically means you've said that you're just going to keep your farm as a farm. This does not instantly disqualify you from building, say, a solar array. It's all right. You just have to obtain approval, whatever approvals are required under your APR agreement. You have to remain in compliance with it, and you have to have documentation of the approval submitted with your application. And then the other note is that any renewable energy project, so basically solar, built on APR land must be sized to serve no more than 200% of the operational load. So what they're trying to do is make sure that you're not using your APR land to build a solar farm and you're just selling the energy back to the grid. If you're doing solar on APR land, they really want it to go towards the farm and not to be sold. It's okay if a little bit of it is sold, though. So can I submit multiple applications? Yes. Much like with REAP, where I said you could submit a renewable energy and a energy efficiency, you can also submit a regular ag energy grant and a special projects application. And you can and should apply to both MDAR and REAP for the same project. So because one is a federal grant and one is a state grant, if you're doing a solar project, for instance, you can absolutely apply to both REAP and MDAR. As I mentioned, most of those farms I showed pictures of did that. Most of them got funding from both of them. If you can apply to REAP, you can absolutely apply to MDAR because it's all the same information, but less of it. The one little wrinkle doesn't come up that often. You can't apply to both MDAR and MFEP. So the Mass Farm Energy Program is funded by MDAR. It's the same pot of money. So you can't apply to both the state and to me for the same project. That does not include the audit funding. I've been asked that a couple times. Audit funding is completely separate. You can get funding from us for the audit and then apply to MDAR for the project. In fact, that's what you should do. You just can't apply for the same project because it's like considered double dipping of the same money. I would never let you do that because I am the only one who does the MFEP application, so hopefully I would know you'd applied to MDAR. I'll make sure that that doesn't happen. Some of the barriers to the MDAR grant, a lot of them can be the same as REAP, where like if it's oversubscribed or you don't submit a complete application, obviously. Some other things that have come up is if what the farm's not considered a commercial operation. We had a couple people apply who weren't really selling anything, so that didn't count. If you have already started the project before the grant awards are announced, you are disqualified. You cannot start construction before the grant is awarded. If you are, even if they were going to give you money, they will disqualify you. And then wrong sizing. So this really only applies to solar and other renewable projects. If you're building a solar project that's way too big for your needs, MDAR sort of frowns on that. So you want to make sure that you work with your contractor so that's appropriately sized to cover your electric needs and not too much more. So for submitting the MDAR application, this is another roof-mounted solar at Valley Malt in Hadley. They got, let's see, $35,000 out of about a $50,000 project, so they did pretty well. They're an example of someone who applied for two projects. They actually applied to REAP for this solar project and then for a variable speed drive, which I don't have a picture of, but they were awarded funding for both of those. So much like REAP, MDAR applications have to be submitted hard copy. There isn't really a drop-off option, so you do have to mail them in. And the deadline hasn't been established for this year. When the applications come out, they will tell us what the deadline is. Last year, the applications came out the very end of February, and the deadline was the end of April. So you're looking at about 2 months from when it comes out to when it's due. As I said before, I have a notification list. If you want to know when the applications come out, just shoot me a quick message. I will put you on it, and I will make sure you know. The same as with REAP, can't be submitted digitally, and you won't get any of your documents back, so make sure you have copies. There are no written reporting requirements for MDAR. They will periodically check on the progress of your projects to make sure that they're going to meet the completion deadline. The completion deadline is the end of the fiscal year, so the fiscal year started July 1st. The fiscal year will start July 1st, 2019. It will end June 30th, 2020. Your projects for this round need to be completed by then. And that's really all for the application. This is just one other thing I want to mention. If anyone is looking at doing a solar hot water project, there are, in addition to all the things I just talked about, incentives from the Mass CEC, which is the Massachusetts Clean Energy Center. So on top of the REAP grant and the MDAR grant, they have incentives for solar hot water projects. And I am the point person for all of that. So whatever you're looking for, if you're doing solar hot water, I'll be happy to help you. This is a nice picture of Dave Smith at Smith's Country Cheese, which I believe has actually now been sold. But the solar panels are still there, so they have a nice solar hot water system on their roof right behind him that they use for their cheese making. And that is all my presentation. We did pretty well. So it's only 11. We got plenty of time for questions. I know there's a bunch of them in there I'm going to look at. I just wanted you to see there's the contact information for myself. I'm Megan. The MDAR contact is Jerry Polano, and then we have our 2 USDA REAP contacts, Ann Correa and Jonathan Burns. Those are their direct lines, so all those numbers should go directly to the person you're trying to call. Technically mine is a hotline, but I'm the only one who answers it, so you'll get me. If by chance you're a farm from Connecticut or you know a farm in Connecticut, there is a similar program to the Mass Farm Energy Program, the Connecticut Farm Energy Program, and I'd be happy to put you in touch with them if you are in a different state. And thank you very much. I just wanted to end with 2 of my favorite pictures. This is a nice Highland cow from Flat Rock Farm in Chesterfield. I think Jonathan's actually on this webinar, so there's your high efficiency water. And that gentleman on the top is Zach Swan from Northeast Solar. They did the install at Little Brook Farm, and there he is petting a goat. All right, I'm going to run through your questions, and you can keep typing them if you got more. Whoever asked, we're going to be able to get the slides. Yes, I have uploaded the slides as a handout on this webinar. I'm also going to email them out to everyone who registered. I have your email addresses, and I will send you a copy of the slides. As I mentioned at the beginning, the webinar has also been recorded, and the recording will be up on the Mass Farm Energy website. It takes it a little while to download and reconfigure and stuff, but once it's up, I will let you know. Do we need to conduct an audit for a renewable heating project? Well, that depends on what you're applying to. All MDAR applications need an audit. I'm not totally sure if it's going to need an audit for REAP or not. If it's on the list of renewable projects that they have like pre-approved, it probably won't, otherwise it might. If it feels tricky, we'll ask the USDA for clarification. Do farms applying under small business categories still need to demonstrate 50% income from their farm? No, that's the beauty of small business. You don't have to demonstrate that 50% of the income comes from the farm. That's why if you are a farm, you might want to apply as a small business. So the answer is no. Who is the state director admin in Mass for the USDA? I'm not totally sure that it's anyone. Let me try that again. I think it's Ann Correa. I'm pretty sure she's the one who awards the state director points. I'm not 100% sure. I don't know that that's her title. I think that's just the title of like the points. But I'm pretty sure she's the one who scores them. I have a completely off-grid project to pump irrigation water using a solar pump. Do I need an energy audit or second meter? Does not make sense as there's no connection to farm power. What a good question. Again, it sort of depends on what you're applying to. So that probably doesn't need an audit for REAP because it's going to be considered a renewable project. You might be able to get away with just an assessment for MDAR instead of looking at all the energy usage on your farm, just like a targeted assessment that will look at that project. There are also special MDAR grants for things involving water, so we might want to talk about that not on the PowerPoint, and see if maybe it would be better to apply for one of their water conservation grants instead of the basic ag energy grant. I might also get Jerry involved in that one because I'm not 100% sure about the answer, but I'm going to see if I can save these questions. So Larry, if you want to connect with me after this, let's do it. Is your assistance based on a fee? It's totally free. So all of my assistance to this webinar, all the grant writing, everything is 100% free. It's funded by MDAR and by a grant that we received from another program. Because CET is a nonprofit, we're almost entirely grant funded. So all the services we provide are free for farms applying to grants. You don't have to pay anything. It's great. Which is why if you want to like shoot out an application, see if it sticks, all you got to do is pay for the postage. Is it possible to find a DUNS number? We have one, but may not be able to find it. Yes. If you go onto the DUNS site and you put in the name of your farm, you should be able to click on it and see what the DUNS number is. How does a farm calculate farm/residence thermal usage? Can it be estimated or must it be measured? It's probably going to need to be measured if it's something you're applying for a grant for. I don't know exactly how you would do that. I would probably get one of the engineers involved and they might be able to figure it out. I don't know off the top of my head. Is the 25% grant based on the total project cost or the cost of the project after other state incentives? It is based off the total project cost. So regardless of what other incentives you might be getting, it's based off the total project cost before that. And it's also, if you're doing solar, before SRECs or any other kind of incentive. So it's based off the flat cost. We are looking to replace our RO machine. Is MDAR the best grant to apply for? That's really up to you. You can apply for both of them. I've had farms apply for both grants for ROs. If the project's under $30,000, you might as well just apply to MDAR. You're going to have to get an audit anyway, and if it falls under $30,000, you can probably get the whole thing funded from MDAR. But you don't have to. It's totally up to you. That's something, again, that we could talk about. Can one apply to an MDAR grant for a cheese-making production where the milk is not produced as part of the same business? I don't think that's going to qualify for MDAR. I think making cheese, if you're not producing the milk, is not going to fly. It's something we could run by Jerry, because I haven't actually had that question before, so we could find out. It will, however, apply for REAP because it counts as a small business, regardless of if it's ag or not. How long does it take to get reimbursed? I'm sorry, Alex, I do not know the answer to that. It really, I think, depends on when the project is done, because I think they have to be completed before you get reimbursed, but I don't know what the turnaround time is. Do I have suggestions for solar companies? Yes, I do. We have a list of solar companies that we know have worked with farms in the past. I'd be happy to send that. Maybe I'll send it along with the notes just so everyone has it. Can solar developers that work with farmers apply for the grants? Kind of. If you're a solar contractor and you want to apply for the grant, like if you want to help the farm, I think you can do that. I don't think you're allowed to do the thing where like the solar contractor owns the array and then they apply for the grant and the grant goes to them. I don't think that's allowed. I think the farm has to own it. But if you have like a very specific situation that you want to talk about, again, just hit me up. We'll do it. Figure it out. But in general, I think the farm has to own the array. REAP loans for bigger projects. I'm not totally sure what you're asking. REAP also has a guaranteed loan program where you can borrow money, but I don't totally know how that works. Is there a loan program to develop dual-use solar that sells energy to the grid? Not that I know of. I mean, there might be. I don't know all the loan programs in Massachusetts. I only really know the ones that go to farms. Robert, maybe we could have a conversation, because I don't know the answer to these questions, and we'll figure them out. Can applicants earn SRECs or AECs? So SRECs are a way of getting credit for solar projects, and AECs are alternative energy credits, which are a way of earning something similar for non-solar PV projects. So can applicants earn SRECs or AECs on projects funded by REAP grant? Absolutely. You can absolutely get SRECs, AECs, whatever you can do on REAP funded or MDAR funded projects. That's, in fact, a thing you should do. That's the last question I have. And it looks like I'm good. So I know I didn't totally answer all of those questions. I did the best I could. If you have additional questions, if you want to talk more about something specifically, give me a call or send me an email. Here's my contact information again. I'm going to email these slides out to you guys in just a couple of minutes, and we will figure it out. Whatever your problem is, we will figure it out. And if I don't know, I will help someone. I'm sorry, if I don't know, I will get you to someone who does. Like, we'll get through it. Thank you all for listening to me talk to you for almost an hour and a half. I'll be sending the slides out very shortly. I'll send out the recording when I get that. And I'm going to see if I can save these questions, so if there's anything I can figure out follow-up for, I will get that to you. Thank you all. I'm going to end the presentation here. If you have any other questions, please just email them to me, and I will get back to you.